Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of For Every Response, sponsored by MSA Safety. I'm Catherine Levin and I'm the editor of Emergency Services Times. For this episode, I asked Professor Shane Ewen to join me to talk about a play that he's been involved with called Trailblazing, Women Have Always Been Firefighters. He is Professor of History at Leeds Beckett University and author of a recent book called Before Grenfell, where he wrote about deregulation that led up to the fire in 2017. He's been researching the history of the Fire and Rescue Service for over 2 decades. I met him after the book came out and I was keen to find out about this new venture and why he had decided to focus on the history of women in the fire service. What you'll hear in this interview is a deep sense of history coming out of communities, about storytelling and the evolution of the fire service culture. It is an impressive collaborative effort to create a play, drawing on research and oral histories. The play shares women's experiences of working in the fire service in the Second World War, in the 1980s and in recent times. It is a West Yorkshire experience, but it speaks to themes that go beyond this part of the country. It shows that much has changed, but as we know, culture takes a long time to evolve, and Shane talks about that later in the interview. Before we talk about the play, Shane starts by setting out the value of commemorating, celebrating and learning from history to move forward to a more inclusive and diverse fire and rescue service.
I'm really passionate about working with stakeholders in and around the fire and rescue service. So people who make decisions, activists, trade unionists, communities who benefit from the work that the Fire and Rescue Service does on a day-to-day basis. Those are the communities that I work with, partners, and I try and write applied histories that are of some kind of practical value or use to the Fire and Rescue Service and the issues that it faces today. And so the subject that we're going to be talking about really is about culture and the traditions, the history and the heritage of the fire service, which, you know, has much that's inspiring and fantastic that we want to celebrate, tales of heroism and the like, but also some of it needs to be called out, challenged and changed. And it's, you know, and it's good to see some of that stuff being done at the moment. For me, history has a clear value to the Fire and Rescue Service in 2 main ways. First of all, it helps us, as I've said, to sort of celebrate and commemorate the brilliant heritage of the service itself. So like the tangible heritage of fire stations and appliances and equipment, but also the intangible side of it, which is basically the people who work for the service, who are protected by the service, and who share the stories and the histories about the service and its operation. So you've got, you know, the plaques, the memorials, the storytelling, and that sort of thing. So I think there's a value there, and then I think there's also a value in what I and my colleagues do as historians. So we do original research using archives, using oral interviews with current and retired firefighters and such like. And we use that as a way in which we can develop and foster creative thinking and improved analytical skills and decision making. And there, really, I'm working with my students, the communities that I work with various fire and rescue services, and the school groups that I go in to talk with. And so the idea there is it's designed to foster improved decision making and a more kind of reflective and appreciative approach towards the work that the Fire and Rescue Service does in protecting local communities. I'd argue that these skills are really important for our engagement as citizens in local communities, and are really, really important for maintaining a functioning democracy, which is obviously very, very important for a public service like the Fire and Rescue Service, but also some, because I think it plays an important role in helping to build a more kind of open and diverse and inclusive service.
Yes, gosh, you've touched on so many different things there. I'm interested that you talk a lot about culture, but also looking back, celebrating and commemorating. And I think the service is good at doing that. It likes to look
Yeah.
back. Unfortunately, some of that commemoration is around the things that have happened in terms of firefighters dying in fires. And we see that coming through about King's Cross fire. We see it from Grenfell. So
Mm.
we want to sort of see how we can learn from history, but also in terms of the positive stories. So you've spoken to lots of fire personnel in the past, and now you're deciding to look at the women's experience of fire. And in this play that you're going to tell us about, it goes
Mm.
right back to the Second World War. And we're talking today on Remembrance Day on the 11th of
Mm.
November, but we're going to look at the Second World War. I wonder if you could tell us why you've decided, given everything you've just described to us, to focus in on the women's experience of fire.
Yeah, that's a really important question for me, actually. I'd say there's probably two very kind of broad reasons why I and my partners are focusing on women's voices. One would be an academic reason. The other would be more about the partnership approach that we take, working with stakeholders, but also local communities. Both of those, I think, would fall under the umbrella of culture and behaviour, and trying to, kind of challenge, but also inspire communities more broadly in being more open about the who is an appropriate person to work for a fire and rescue service. So on the first point, the kind of academic point, really, in the last 10 years, I've read a number of books that have all by women authors who have inspired me to challenge myself in my own approach to thinking more about the diversity of the stories and the histories that I've explored up to now. So the first one that I read was Josephine Reynolds' biography, Firewoman, which you're nodding, so you know.
Yes,
yeah,
yes, I've read it. Yes.
I think that was the first one I read. So you've got Josephine Reynolds as Norfolk's first operational female firefighter, appointed in 1982. And, it's a really interesting and engaging read. It's challenging in parts, as I think it probably should be. But it's also inspiring for the way that she came through it at the end, and she's now got this speaking career where she's an inspirational, motivational speaker, which I think is great. The second book that I read, and I'll hold it up here, is Sabrina Cohen Hatton's The Heat of the Moment, which in some respects is similar to Josephine's book, but is also different because it's a bit more focused on the way in which senior firefighters make very, very important decisions and relay that decision making to their colleagues in the heat of the moment when they're on an emergency call. And there's a really eye-opening section sort of midway through the book that I was rereading earlier today, in which she talks about some of the stigmatizing language and the sexism and misogyny that she faced when she joined the fire and rescue service at the start of this century. So you're about 2 decades on from Josephine Reynolds, but women are still facing similar hurdles and obstacles. So that was really interesting to me. And then the third, which is not by operational firefighters, but by activists, is a book, and you'll have to pardon my pronunciation a little bit here, but Edwidge Giunta and Mary Ann Trascati wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago called Talking to the Girls. And it's a collection of essays written by activists, artists, teachers, and even family members that focuses on the history and the legacy of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in New York in 1911.
I know it. Yes.
Yeah, so it's an iconic event because 146 workers lost their lives, the vast majority of which were young women, especially young immigrant women and girls. So the fire, it's a fantastic book because it's not just a historical account of that fire. It's also a call to arms for all of us today to use the legacy of these stories and the women who lost their lives in that specific incident as a way in which you can challenge and call out misogyny, sexism, and other problems in today's society, in advocating things like women's rights, but also more broadly just improved health and safety, the importance of trade unions, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of academic area that's really influenced me.
So it's interesting that you've touched on three things there, which are, the sort of 1980s, the beginning of women coming into the fire service. Sabrina's experience, who's now the chief of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fire Service, so she's come from right from being a firefighter all the way through, and talking about a fire which is over 100 years ago in America, and about how those three things have influenced you. So coming on to the play itself, so this is Trailblazing, Women Have Always Been Firefighters. Question mark. I wasn't sure there was a question mark on actually. What's the inspiration? So you didn't write this play. You're not the scriptwriter. So could you explain what the relationship is between the scriptwriter who's written this play and your work at university and all of that research you've just shared with us?
Yeah, I can do, but I might have to take a brief step back just to explain some of the context, if that's all right, before I get to talking about the script writer. It'll all make sense, I think. But really, so I've talked a bit about we here, haven't I? I've used the plural terminology here. So I am working with a social arts charity called Space 2, who advocate using the arts and creative methodologies as a way of engaging communities in history and heritage. Now they are based at a site called the Old Fire Station in Gipton, which is in East Leeds, which is and it's a very disadvantaged part of the city and very high on the indicators of social deprivation in the country as a whole. So the building was opened in 1937 as an operational fire station for the then Leeds Fire Brigade. And it was at one point in the 1990s, the busiest operational fire station in the country. And in 2014, it was closed by West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service because they'd recently opened a brand new, much more kind of multi-purpose, multifunctional station up at Beckett, a couple of miles away. So it had kind of reached the end of its life, but it was such an important community asset that a local entrepreneur called Jimmy Hasseldom, who was born and brought up in the immediate vicinity of the station, he died a few years earlier and left a fund behind, and his family wanted to kind of give something back, so to the local community. So anyway, so the station was saved from demolition, and it was handed over to a community fund that refurbished it and opened it as a community hub in East Leeds. Within that, there was a group of retired firefighters, firemen, as they would have been known, joining in the 1960s and 1970s when that language was commonplace. And they formed a heritage group along with their wives, their daughters, and other family members and people interested in the history and heritage of the service to help give this new era in the station some historical authenticity through sharing stories, through sharing objects, pictures, and things like that. And as we came out of the pandemic in 2021, we decided as a group, so that by me, my Space 2 contacts and the people who run the old fire station, we thought to diversify some of the stories that we were sharing, to give more of a voice to the female members who made up the heritage group, but also to other people, women who have passed through the fire station in an operational and also a non-operational capacity over the years. So we started to do that, and we got some funding from the National Heritage Lottery Fund to support this. And it's fantastic because the group members, they are predominantly men of a certain vintage, shall we say. So they do have particular views and attitudes towards, all sorts of things. And they, I'm really pleased to say, have challenged their attitudes around women working in the fire service, especially in frontline operations. We managed to bring in to meet with the group women who served alongside them in the 1980s and 1990s, and they get to kind of catch up over a cup of tea, and talk about old incidents that they went out on. And you can see with those conversations that they respect these women, that these women prove themselves as perfectly, competent, exceptional firefighters who could be trusted in an emergency. So the project kind of evolved out of that idea around trying to diversify the stories and the voices that we were sharing through Space 2 in the old fire station. And so the play is really interesting because when we wrote the application to the Heritage Lottery Fund project, that was it. The play is included in it as one of our outputs, along with story maps that I'll talk about shortly. And the idea behind this is that it's about using creative artistic methods as a way in which you can share stories with communities. So you take something like theatre, I guess historically there is a kind of fusty old view about theatre and who it appeals to, in terms of being, quite a middle class educated audience. But actually, we actually disagree with that. We think there's some really, really interesting and engaging examples of working class theatre and of community theatre. So we really wanted to have this play that would travel around community centres, schools, and other local community hubs in and around Leeds and West Yorkshire, to take theatre and the stories within the play to audiences and who could maybe enjoy the play in a more familiar space, and have a cup of tea and a biscuit, and then ask questions of the scriptwriter, the actor, the director, and even myself in a more kind of, I guess I'll use the phrase safe space, where they feel that they can speak out and ask questions about it.
It's very unusual, Shane, though, what you're describing. I mean, in terms of, you're right, theatre is it's expensive. I mean, if you go to theatre in London, it costs so much money. You never get to meet the actors unless you're standing outside the stage door, looking for an autograph, perhaps. And the sense of it being stories and community and very hyper local. The firefighters, the firemen that you met at the community hub, who created this heritage group, do they all still live in the area? Are there sense of? I imagine community hubs are actually something that has been decimated by austerity. That actually finding its spaces to do it is quite hard. So how have you found that in terms of taking that sort of principle of community-led, getting it out there at this hyper local level, when actually a lot of these venues don't exist anymore?
Yeah. It's a really, really important point, actually. And people, communities are being priced out of art and culture, aren't they?
Yeah, but also just finding spaces to do it. I mean, where are these village halls of my childhood?
The interesting thing is that, certainly in Leeds, there are a few examples of very, very active community hubs and community centres and theatre spaces, not-for-profit organisations that that bit our hands off when we offered them the opportunity to have the play put on in their spaces. So obviously you have the old fire station itself, which is where the play premiered, which made a lot of sense in terms of some of the stories having occurred under the roof in the engine room and the crew rooms. So that was important. But then it's been travelling around the city in places like Chapel FM, in Seven Arts Cafe, and even in community gardens. We put the play on outside. Luckily, it was a dry day. It was a bit chilly, but it was outside in a community garden that is being looked after by an asylum seekers art group in a very deprived inner city neighbourhood in Leeds that has been in the national news for all sorts of reasons over the past sort of 12 to 18 months for all the wrong reasons. So if you work hard enough at identifying the locations, if you get a bit lucky with the weather on occasion, you can do this, and it is about giving something back. And the old firefighters who make up the group, Gipton Fire Station had, as a lot of fire stations did back in the day, it had housing attached to it that the council had provided for the exclusive use of the firefighters and their families. Obviously, over the years, certainly since the 1980s, a lot of that housing had been sold off under right to buy. The group, however, still live in the house that they lived in back in the 1970s. So that, and they're active members of the group, and they meet at the fire station most days in the week for a cup of tea and a bit of a natter, because to them, Gipton is the fire and rescue service. It is their history. It is hyper local and hyper individual, and it's really, really important to them. And now they're in their early 80s, and they've been associated with Gipton for 50 years now, which is a really inspiring story in and of itself.
But they're not the women. They're not the women's stories.
They're not the women. No.
Finding. And you said that women firefighters were talking to the firefighters at Gipton to say to sort of describe their experience. But if they'd left before the early 80s, then they're not going to experience working with women. How did you find women to talk to in West Yorkshire? Did you go via the fire service? And how do you track people down?
Yeah, I mean, actually some of the members of the group were still operational up until around about the second national fire strike in the early part of this century. So they had actually worked with female firefighters on their watch in the early 1990s. So we managed to track a couple of them down through personal contacts. I also contacted West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, who have been a massive supporter of the project. They put me on to particular women who they thought would have good stories to share, but who were also happy to do so, because I'm very conscious of the fact that if I say to somebody who is maybe done 30 years in the fire and rescue service, I'd love to interview you about the history of the fire and rescue service, immediately they think, oh God, I must be old now. So, and the way things were done back then in the 1980s, 1990s is very different to how it is today. But actually, on the contrary, I found that the people I've interviewed who are either still operational or have recently retired in the last sort of 5-10 years, they're very keen to share their stories. Most of which are actually, very positive, and hopeful about some of the changes that have been made, whilst also recognising that there's still, quite a bit of work to be done, certainly in terms of upping the numbers of frontline female firefighters.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond, shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the emergency services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, we go in with you.
My involvement with the play was as the researcher. So I did the research with my students into the stories, particularly around the time of the Second World War, but also the 1980s, two very, very important moments in the history of women getting a footing in the fire and rescue service. And then I handed over the materials to the all-women team who basically wrote, produced, directed, and perform the play itself. So I think it would be unfair for me not at this point to give credit to those women. So the script writer is a Hull-based academic called Sarah Jane Dickinson, who's done some really, really interesting work around giving women a voice through theatre, both as performers, writers, but also audience members. So this is Sarah Jane's script, and it's based on her interviewing me about my research, her understanding and analysis, if you like, of the materials that I fed to her, and also her own experiences as a woman visiting fire stations, but also care homes. There's a leading character, Val, who's based in a care home, and I know that the character of Val is a composite based on a number of wartime stories, but also of women who have been through the care home system in the recent past, who maybe served in the fire service around the time of the Second World War or into the 1950s, 1960s. So she's played a very, very important role. And then there's Coralie Datta and Emma Tregidden from Space 2. So they're kind of like they're the co-producers and directors. But Coralie heads up. She runs the Heritage Group. So she's the contact I have the most to do with on a sort of day-to-day, weekly basis, and she's fantastic. And she's the force behind taking the play on a tour. Then there's Emma James, who designed the set, which makes wonderful use of ladders and uniforms and helmets and helmet changes during the play in order to signify which period the actor is in. And then last but not least, we've got Jane Morland, who is the performer, and does an absolutely brilliant job over about 40 minutes, giving multiple voices to the women's stories. Broadly speaking, there's three main characters, but there's an awful lot of other kind of sub-characters, including men, firemen, and Jane brings all of those voices to life. And she's been deservedly praised for, delivering this all, this play in a very kind of monologue style, which is really, really engaging. So it's very much an all-women production about women, and my involvement is very much at the research stage rather than in a delivery. But I've attended multiple performances, and I've even been in the odd Q&A discussion at the end.
Oh, thank you for mapping that. That's really interesting to understand how a play evolves, where it comes from, and all of the different contributors and where that's done. I read the script. I haven't been to see the play, but I read it to help for this interview today. And I sort of describe it as being warm and funny, fierce and courageous. And I wondered with the dialogue how much of it had been imagined and how much of it was testimony. So it's interesting to learn that it's composite and be able to draw it all together. And having seen that development and knowing the original source materials, how close do you feel that it's got to how you felt about what you'd read? Does it feel like it's kind of a true representation of it, or has it kind of been slightly stylized to make it more palatable to an audience in a theatre setting?
I mean, it feels authentic to me, and in a funny sort of way. I feel like some of So some of the characters, and I can imagine the real people that they are loosely based upon, but I can also see how they've been given more depth, in a way that, with the best will in the world, you never get to when you're researching them through, documentary archives. And certainly for Val, who served during the Second World War, I feel like the person I like to think she's kind of loosely based on feels more real and tangible, human to me now, which is really good. So I think I like to compare it. There was a film released in 2015, so 10 years ago, called Suffragette, directed by Sarah Gavron, and it stars Carey Mulligan. And so it's about the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century, and the characters are, some of them are real. So the Pankhursts are there, obviously, but some of them are fictional characters based on composites of real historical people, where they've kind of spliced together bits of their stories together into something that I guess is more whole than you would get in the archive itself. So it feels like that to me.
And you mentioned West Yorkshire earlier, West Yorkshire Fire Service, and I know that you've been working with them. How did they feel, having seen it, read the script, that it reflects the fire service? Because we'll want to look forward with the service in terms of culture and women's roles, but actually reflecting on it, how does that, what's their response been like?
Their response is very, very positive and very supportive. I mean, like everyone who works in the fire and rescue service, we know that there's aspects of, the social history, certainly from the 1970s and 1980s, that are not, are difficult to digest, difficult to swallow. Some of the stories, some of the prejudices that women came up against are, were, even for the time, appalling, and more so, with the vantage point of looking back. So the fire, so West Yorkshire is very keen to have a performance of the play themselves at the headquarters at Birkenshaw, just outside of Bradford. It's very soon to be formally reopened. So watch this space. Anybody listening who's from West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, we are coming to a venue near you soon. And just more generally, West Yorkshire have been a big supporter of us. In particular, the Deputy Chief Officer Dave Walton is, he and I go back quite a few years now, and he's very supportive of the work that I've been doing and the work that Space 2 have been doing. We have this annual event called Fire Engine Day. It's a sort of family community event at Gipton, and West Yorkshire always sends one of the appliances down with the crew, and they put on demonstrations to the children and the families. So it's a kind of it's an open day kind of format, but it's a former operational fire station. So it's a really good example of community relations, I think. So
great, and it's good. I'm not surprised when you say that about Dave Walton. He's somebody I've spoken to many times over the years. So it's great that to have that West Yorkshire support and for you to put it on their lovely headquarters, which I visited myself. It's very nice.
Yeah.
So the other organisation. So you've done. Well, they put on several performances of the play. It's still going, I think, until January in various community venues, as you've said. Do you know if Women in the Fire Service has had a look at what you've been doing, or have you spoken to them through the production or process of creating this as a national movement representing women in the fire service today? What are their thoughts on it?
Yeah, I have talked to women in the fire service about the play, but also about the project more generally. So I had a conversation with Catherine Billing, the Chief Fire Officer at Cornwall, who's a director of that organisation, and she's been a big supporter of what we're trying to do up here. So I think that's really good, and I think that bodes well to potentially if we can make it work, taking the play to a national audience, which I think would be really, really important. I think it would be a good legacy for the project. And I also think it will be a really good moment for the Fire and Rescue Service to celebrate the major milestones that women have gone through in terms of, proving themselves, as firefighters. So I'd love to take the project to the national level, also to other organisations like the NFCC and also the trade unions, because I think they've all done some really interesting work around equality, diversity, and anti-discrimination measures over the years. So again, I think their members, their stakeholders would get something out of this. I think although the stories are about Yorkshire, I think they speak to a national audience. They probably also speak to an international audience, to be honest. These are live issues of women coming up against obstacles and barriers, as you well know. So again, in that context, I think it's important to remind everybody that these cultural barriers are historical, that culture takes years to change. It's cultural change is never an overnight flicking of a switch, and we see that with the stories that we're sharing.
Yes, and we talk about culture a lot with the Fire and Rescue Service, and I have to say it's nice to have a conversation with you about that historical, the background to it. So it does take a long time to change, and it's not just going to be done through reports and so forth. Just because we're running out of time for our conversation, unfortunately, I could talk about this for a very long time. A couple of things I just wanted to ask you quickly. In terms of the funding, you've been able to put it out through the area that you're in Yorkshire. But in terms of spreading it elsewhere, you would need funding to do that, because that's not under your current National Heritage Lottery Fund arrangements. Also, that recording it and putting it online seems the logical thing to do. Are you able to fund that under these arrangements and put it on YouTube for everybody else to have a look at?
Well, sadly not. Sadly, it's not included in the budget, and we had a little bit of a look into how much professional filming would cost us. So because Space 2 is a charity, we're not currently able to do that to a proper kind of level. So if anybody out there would like to
so there's an opportunity there. So if people wanted to, through organisations or funding that they've got elsewhere, approach you about doing that to spread the awareness and expose people, then you'd be up for that conversation.
Yeah, or even if they wanted to recommend, a funding stream that we could potentially tap into and put an application in.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll put your details in our show notes so that people can get in touch with you directly if they want to follow up on that. I know that women's history of the Fire and Rescue Service is not your only research interest, and you'll obviously be doing lots of other work going forward. But will that continue to be in the fire service space once you sort of moved away from this area? Do you plan to do any more work in this area?
I see. Well, yes, undoubtedly. Given I've spent such a long time in that space already, I think there's a lot more work to be done. I've been starting to delve into the kind of historical relationship between the different emergency services a bit more. Going back to something I started out on 20 years ago now. So I'm quite interested in I guess the history of interoperability, to use the modern term, but blue light collaboration I prefer to call it. But then the HLF project runs until the end of next year, 2026. So we've got various events and other activities that need to be completed first. I need to write up the reports and the publications. I would also really like to think about commemorating some of the women, the women firefighters who paid the ultimate sacrifice during the Second World War. So there are a number of women in London, but also in provincial fire brigades, who were working in control rooms, who were driving motorbikes and fire and cars whilst in uniform, who suffered accidents. They're working in fire stations when they were hit by parachute bombs and heavy explosive bombs. And I think it's time to start thinking about commemorating the women's sacrifices here. So schemes like the Fire Brigades Union's Red Plaque scheme, which I'm very heavily involved with, that's an outlet that I'd like to do more with in order to diversify that side of the stories as well.
So privileged to be able to talk to you about it and to learn about it and all of these amazing people that you've been working with. So I realise this isn't just you, this is a whole team and collaborative effort. Your partnership has produced something quite special. So I hope to get up to Yorkshire and come and have a look at it myself rather than just reading the script. That would be lovely.
But for today, you'd be more than welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you, and thank you for joining For Every Response.
Thank you.
Well, what a great conversation. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed talking to Shane. As you heard, the play, Trailblazing, Women Have Always Been Firefighters, will continue to run during 2026 at venues in West Yorkshire, and hopefully we'll move south to the Fire Service College for the Women in the Fire Service Training and Development Weekend that takes place in June. If you want to find out more, check out the links in the show notes. My thanks to Shane for talking to me. Look out next week for more sessions from the Emergency Services Show and the Emergency Tech Show. All our podcast episodes are sponsored by MSA Safety, and we're so grateful to them for their support. Thanks also to Tom St. John for expertly producing this episode. Be sure to share, like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times.